appropriated funds and one annually appropriated fund. So we feel like we have some ground to stand on there to say to the governor's office and the legislature, like it just operationally makes a lot more sense to have consistency across the funds. Also, the nature of the business of the enterprise is that grants are awarded and then they're multi-year in nature. So to administer the program, it's very difficult to do that with an annual appropriation. So we felt like, we would propose to the board that you consider an action to submit a decision item that requests that they look at giving us continuous spending authority. Next slide. So how that would work is we would need to submit a formal decision item to the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budgeting for approval by August 1st. So that's right around the corner. We just have a month to kind of put that together, which staff can do. And then we would hear back from OSPB whether that request is approved or denied by about mid-October. If it's approved, the request would be submitted to the legislature, the Joint Budget Committee on November 1st as part of the governor's budget request to the legislature. So it is a request that requires legislation. So, after November 1st, when that goes across to the legislature, the enterprise may be required to defend that request to the JBC during the department's hearing, typically in November. But if eventually we get through the process and that request is approved by the JBC, legislation would be introduced during the session, and hopefully we would be able to kind of get that approved and then get the fund continuously appropriated, which would kind of resolve a lot of these mechanical issues around the spending authority. Next slide. So we kind of wrote up a proposed motion. If that's something that makes sense, this would be a potential action that the board could take. But I'm happy to take any questions or have any discussion, because I know that was kind of it's a unique situation.
Do you have any questions for Bethany?
I have a question. What's the potential downside to not doing it? I mean, besides the hassle, are there any other administrative downsides to not doing it?
I think, the risk there is if they deny the request.
Right.
So, then we would be left kind of without that roll forward ability. So we do have kind of the option to not request continuous spending authority, but to go back again and say, hey, just give us roll forward authority. We'll stick with the annual appropriation, which is maybe like a lesser kind of request. So it's really hard to predict how the governor's office and the legislature are going to respond to these things, whether they're going to be supportive or not. So that's kind of the risk there. But it's tough.
Yeah, you're in a pickle. Thanks.
I think if OSPB does come back and they're like, hey, we don't want to support this, we do have, if it's OSPB that comes back to us, we probably do have the ability to chat with them and say, hey, if you don't support this, could we put in a request for to get that footnote back? And so, we could have that conversation at that point and see if, we have a plan B maybe.
I have a question. You said, I think on the last slide, that enterprise board members may need to defend the request at the JBC. And I'm just kind of wondering what challenges or questions we might anticipate at the JBC.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Joint Budget Committee, the reason they annually appropriate is because they, it gives them a chance to have oversight and approval authority over kind of looking at that annually every year. So you may get questions about kind of the logistics of the grants and how long they take to spend and like how the program's doing and things like that. But it's hard. It's again, hard to predict. Sometimes they may not even discuss it or ask any questions. If their schedule's tight, it just really depends on what they're interested in and how things go.
All right, so with the unfortunate reality that we don't have a quorum today, it looks like we had 2 people who were unable to join us. We wouldn't be able to actually make this motion today, but I was chatting with our chief financial officer, and it sounds like we would be able to move to the approval for the Office of State Budget. We would, if we have a general sense that the board would be interested in pursuing this option, but we would need a formal board approval before we would go to the Joint Budget Committee.
Well, and Kay, hello, this is Jeff. I just wanted to chime in and double check with Bethany to see if she has any thoughts on this. We were just chatting, recognizing that we didn't have a quorum, and I'm sorry, I don't know why my camera isn't coming on, but my sense is potentially, and now I'm sideways, so that wasn't really an improvement. But my sense is that if we are not able to take a resolution of approval today, that since that August 1 deadline is really sort of an internal state deadline to OSPB, that we'd probably be okay, but I would want to make sure that we have board approval before anything moves on to the JBC. But Bethany, do you generally concur with that?
Yeah, I think ideally we would love to have board approval prior to that August 1 deadline. I don't know if the board meets in July, but if not, we could probably do a submission, and it is something like, we could always withdraw, I guess, with that, if we ran into issues where the board kind of had second thoughts.
I could also get in touch with our general counsel as well and see if we can do a vote in another manner as well before then, because the recording of the meeting will be posted, and other board members would be able to hear the conversation and ask questions before we would do potentially a virtual vote, which I think our bylaws allow. So we could investigate that possibility as well.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I guess just so I'm clear on the next steps with that, Kay, Kelly, you're going to look into how the board can vote either in the next meeting or potentially virtually before the August deadline, and get back to the board directors on that.
That's correct. I will look into whether we can do a virtual vote, or we may decide to put a quick 30-minute meeting on everyone's calendar in July to get that approval before the August 1st deadline.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks. Okay, next on the agenda, we have a update on the grants from Paul DeRocher and Mike King.
All right, I'm going to actually start, and then I'll hand it over to Paul in a few slides here. So just a brief recap for the board members that round 1 of the CTE grants, we have 4 different grant categories that the CTE is empowered to make. The planning projects, we held the call for projects last year in 2023. In October, the board approved 4 awards in the planning category. And so as an update on those previous awards, the contracting is in progress. It's underway, and we expect notices to proceed in the fall of 2024. So that's sort of the old news that you were already aware of, just to recap. And then the other three grant categories that we're grouping together under the heading of capital, we issued a notice of funding availability in March of 2024. The application period closed in May. We have roughly $15 million in clean transit enterprise funding that was made available through that call. As a side note, at the same time that the CTE call was issued, there were also other calls for projects through the department, including the Volkswagen settlement. So in addition to that 15 million, there are about 16 million in remaining Volkswagen settlement funds, and then a number of other state and federal funds offered simultaneously. We received over $25 million worth of requests just in the CTE categories, 2 applications in the facilities category, 3 in the charging or fueling infrastructure category, and then 11 in the vehicles category, for a total of 35 vehicles being sought by applicants. I will show you some more detailed breakdown on the next slides of all of those. And so at this point, we are reviewing applications. The scoring process is underway with the committee, and we will be bringing recommendations for discussion and approval by the board at a future meeting. So in terms of the summary of what we received at a very high level, you can see the 3 charging and fueling applications and the requested amounts on the right. And then the 2 facility modifications requests below those. One note is that the requested amount is not necessarily the same as the eligible amount. So it's possible that an applicant has requested either more funding or less funding than they are actually eligible for by the rules of the program. So part of our assessment is determining is the amount requested the same as the amount they are eligible to receive. Next slide, please. In terms of the vehicle applications, again, you can see the names of the applicants, so very high level project titles, number of vehicles sought, and the requested dollar amounts on the right. And just as with the previous, that requested amount is not necessarily what the applicant is eligible for. So those may be adjusted through the scoring process if they're awarded. I'll also note that the asterisk that you see next to the Town of Breckenridge, Roaring Fork Vet Transportation Authority, and Town of Winter Park, in addition to these requests, they have sought Volkswagen funding for the same projects because those 2 funding types can be combined. And so you're not seeing the full picture of their applications for Volkswagen settlement on this, but those are also an additional possible funding source for those 3 projects. And again, you see a total of 35 vehicles overall statewide and close to $20 million just for vehicles. I might pause here before I hand it over to Paul to see if there's any questions about the response. Obviously, we're not looking to share application details at this point, but if there are general questions, I'd be happy to address them.
I have one, Mike. Sorry, I stepped away. I may have missed it. I had to close my windows. It's raining super hard here, which is great. But I see, like, are all these for complete vehicles, or some of them are incremental cost of upgrading to a BEV? Like, I just see variations in price there based on the units and costs. So what's going on?
Yeah, there's a couple factors. So the grant structure of the Clean Transit Enterprise for vehicles is that we are able to fund up to 100% of the incremental cost. So none of these would be able to fund the complete cost of a vehicle because the way the program was structured and approved by the board, it can only be incremental cost. Now, the price differences in part are because some of these vehicles are full-size buses, some of them are vans or cutaways. There's obviously also different manufacturers and other factors, but I also noted the difference in the requested amounts. And part of it is that sometimes applicants don't request that full incremental cost. Sometimes they are purchasing a a smaller vehicle, etc. So part of the scoring will be determining why those amounts are differing. Is that appropriate? And what are the grants able to support?
Great, thank you.
I have a question about one of the projects listed on a previous slide, and if you can't get too far in the weeds on it, no worries. But
yes,
there was
can you
one,
go back,
I think,
Desiree? Back one slide, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so via mobility services, renewable energy microgrid project. Can you say more about what that is and whether CTE funds, like this is an eligible use of CTE funds?
Yes, I mean, without going into too much detail, I would say that in general, the facility category of CTE funding is intentionally somewhat broad. And I think that in scoring the application, part of the question will be which elements of the project are considered eligible. And of course, the board would have the ultimate say on a question like that. In the case of this project and others like it that I'm familiar with, there is an argument that having a combined charging, power generation, power storage system in a transit fleet creates resilience, manages costs, and allows a fleet to transition to ZEVs in a way that protects them from unexpected disruptions to the grid, et cetera. So I think that there is potentially a clear connection between this type of facilities project and the core mission of the Clean Transit Enterprise. But I think each proposal in the facilities category is likely to raise some of those questions about, is this in line with the goals of the enterprise, or is this considered outside the bounds of that eligibility?
Thanks for that answer. Then I had one other question on the next slide, which was, I mean, overall, I think this is a pretty good spread. It's nice to get interest from transit agencies across the state. Like some just noticeable absences for me are the largest two transit agencies in the state, which are the Mountain Metro and the Springs and RTD. I think I have a sense of where RTD is at with electric buses, but I'm just wondering if you can share anything about sort of what those two agencies have said regarding the CTE opportunity, and yeah, whether they've expressed interest in future rounds, kind of where they're at with electric buses in general.
Yeah, well, so I obviously don't want to speak for another organization. I can say that I think everyone is aware that RTD is in the midst of a fleet transition planning effort that is expected to conclude sometime later this year. And so I think that part of their absence here is because they are trying to determine that future direction and then potentially pursue funding through this and other sources. In terms of Mountain Metro, I have not had direct conversations with them recently. They have had some zero emission buses in their fleet. They've also had some negative experiences with the initial deployment of those. So I think similar to RTD, they're in a stage of considering their future options and making those decisions. So yeah, obviously those are two agencies. There are other agencies in the state who I think we might have hoped or expected to see in this round, but I'm trying to not to draw too many conclusions just from the first round, because I think a lot of folks are at a different stage of deployment. Either they've just received buses and they're focused on that. They are developing a plan, so they're not yet ready to apply. But I do think it's appropriate between rounds to do that outreach and get a sense of, are there things we can do to the program to make it more attractive? Is it just a timing issue? Are there bigger structural issues that the board should be aware of?
Mike, I have a follow-on question to that. Is this what you expected? Is this on par with the quality, the quantity of applications and the number of vehicles and chargers that we're expecting, or is there still a lot more work to be done in terms of getting the word out that this is an opportunity?
I'm personally encouraged by this response. The previous 3 years of the Volkswagen settlement grants, we were seeing a declining response. Again, I think in part because a lot of folks applied in the first year and then were occupied with implementation. And so the low hanging fruit, so to speak, was all picked, and other people were just starting their planning process. So I'm glad to see the number and variety of fleets here. We have several fleets that have initial deployments and are clearly in the mindset of scaling up to the next phase. We have several that, to my knowledge, are first-time applicants seeking their first or maybe second vehicle. So I think that this is a very positive start. Obviously, we'd always like more response, but I think that we have a good mix of veterans, new entrants, and also a good mix of different vehicle types, and to a lesser extent, a mix of geography. We're still seeing a clear Front Range and I-70 mountain trend, but Telluride, for example, and some of the others that are coming on are expanding a little bit outside of those core areas. So I'm optimistic, and I think that this, combined with the fact that we're funding planning efforts in other communities, that is going to be the on-ramp for those folks to apply next year or the year afterwards. So I think that these things have a self-reinforcing element to them.
Awesome. Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, I will pass the next slide to Paul.
Okay, cool, great. So Mike was really talking about, I guess, our current trajectory and the projects that we're considering under the CTE grants. And what I'd like to just brief the board on here is how we are planning to maneuver our grant program in the future. So one of the things that is important to underline, and perhaps people are already aware, is that all of the CTE notices of funding are consolidated within DTR calls for projects. So when we did the capital call and resulted in the projects that Mike just went over, we also have several other projects that are packaged within that same timeline that are outside of CTE funding. So given that background, we wanted to give you all some information about a conversation that we're having here internally, and given that Jeff Sudmeier's on the call, I'll invite him to weigh into the conversation as well. Right now, we have the 2025 NOVAs for both admin operating as well as the capital projects are under discussion for when we plan to release them. And we're kind of specifically focused on admin operating because that's our next call, but it may influence capital projects as well, just in terms of how we package them. Right now, our period of performance for admin operating calls for project is scheduled to conclude in December 31st. And the proposal that we're discussing is to issue a call for projects a little later in the year for admin operating, such that it would not begin until July 1st. And what that would result in is a 6-month gap that we're needing to find some funding for and figure out how we can fill that for agencies that depend on that admin operating funding. In some cases, it comprises 100% of their total operating funding for transit, or at least 80%. And it's a significant component. So the consideration for the board, and welcome discussion on this, is how does that impact CTE? Well, we package those planning grants, as Mike discussed, within that admin operating call. So whereas we normally would be very close to issuing a call for projects in admin operating, we may be a few months out from that and potentially not contracting those until the middle of next year. So in terms of your objectives with getting funding out, I understand there's significant pressure there. But really, we wanted to invite you into this discussion. This is also something we were planning to discuss with the Transit and Rail Advisory Committee, or TRAC, to get their feedback on. That meeting is until the end of July, but we felt like this was a good topic to bring to this board now and take that feedback into consideration while we're discussing internally. So with that, I'll open for conversation. Jeff, anything further you'd like to add on this?
No, Paul, I think you described it well. So, happy to help if there are questions, but otherwise I think you captured it well.
Okay, well, I guess if there aren't questions, we can move on. And we'll keep you apprised of where we land with this. But yeah, that's all I had for today.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Keep us posted on that. Next on the agenda is the Senate Bill 230 update from Director Lou and Kay Kelly and Lisa Kaufman. Take it away.
All right. Can you hear and see me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I think that Lisa got tied up and is not going to be able to join us today. So Kay and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the exciting new legislative developments and, really how that's going to, in a lot of ways, change and expand the mission of this particular commission. So as you may know, there were a number of really exciting transit and rail bills that passed through the legislature this year. Really a package, some of which were focused on funding, some on safety, some on new authorities to encourage just transition. Really, a holistic package that together makes one of the biggest investments in transit and rail in the state's history. Of particular relevance to this board is Senate Bill 230, a historic compromise between oil and gas and environmental groups in order to make a big down payment on our transit needs, and in particular, a focus on operations and maintenance, which, as you all well know, is one of the areas where we've been deeply, deeply underinvested for a long time. The other packages, and just for your awareness, SB 184 is the other main funding initiative. The dollars for that funding stream flowed through CTIO, the Clean Transportation Investment Office, which sort of leads the transportation public-private partnerships. So there will be a lot of complementary work between these two areas of funding, but they're under two different governance structures. SB 230 really tries to balance the needs of O&M, across different parts of the transit and rail portfolio. The bill writ large begins, with a split between funding for public lands and conservation and funding for transit. With respect to transit in particular, it's a significant amount that estimates to be, in and around $100 million a year in the transit and rail space. And that's essentially, can we go to the slide that shows the bifurcation of funding? So you can see it's starting at a little over 100 million, as I mentioned, and then expanding over time to a much larger sum in order to, grow with the economy and keep those investments in transit growing with economic trends. The way that and then let's go to the next slide. Maybe not that slide. Kay, do we have a slide that shows the three main buckets of funding?
Yep, that's the slide that follows this, but
Okay.
but this one was in there just to
Yeah.
note that we keep our existing business purpose, our
Yes,
existing
keep
revenue streams.
keep our existing business purpose and revenue stream, and this new set of authorities is additive. So the transit and rail funding breaks down into three main groups. The largest piece of that investment, and this is within the overall denominator for transit, 70% of the dollars flow through to local transit operations through a distribution methodology that will have to be worked through this body. So that's going to be a huge piece of work to develop the specifics of the allocation method in order to distribute those dollars to local entities that can invest in sort of the highest and best purpose for those funds. Again, there's a major focus on operations and maintenance, given the gap that's existed for a long time in that space. And thinking through how those how that distribution will work is something that's going to have to be a very organized and robust process, because it's got a lot of nuances, and that that I suspect will consume a lot of energy amongst this governing body for the coming months into the next year. The second major source of funds is a 20%, and this is again out of the transit funding, a 20% set aside for rail funding. That is really intended to complement the dollars being distributed through SB 184, and together those two pots of funding could average upwards of $100 million just for rail. So a really major investment to advance some of the state's key strategic rail priority projects, alongside these significant investments in local transit connectivity that are intended to kind of collectively establish both those arterial spines that will connect the whole state, and then transit-oriented development and local ecosystems where transit can really pick people up at each focal point and result in mode shift within communities. And then finally, there's a transit grant program that will be a competitive program with the balance of 10% of the transit funding. And that too is an area where developing the competition criteria and the grant cycles is going to have to be a big piece of business for this group, and require a lot of nuance to make sure that in each case we're getting the most bang for the buck out of the source, but also thinking about how all of these sources of dollars work and complement, because again, there's three programs that are intended to work together coming out of this source of funds under the governance jurisdiction of CTE. I think that Lisa just jumped on, so I want to make sure that if she's here, she's able to chime in.
Thanks, Shoshana. Yeah, first want to thank everyone that's on this call that helped make these legislative wins possible. It was a transformational legislative session as far as transit and rail funding and land use and housing policies, and the way the governor really kind of approaches this as a holistic agenda around having more dense housing and people not having to commute as far to the services they need, groceries and their jobs, but that then everyone has transit options to perform those functions. And the expansion of service over this governorship and into the future is a key goal that we have. And that includes a establishment of new passenger rail, as we think passenger rail not only helps as a transportation solution, but drives much more forcefully some of those land use planning decisions at the local level as well, to achieve our ultimate GHG reduction goals and climate goals. So it's an exciting time, but the legislature left a lot for administration to implement, and there's a lot of work ahead of us to implement this and to implement it across multiple agencies and enterprises in a coordinated way that really gets the biggest bang for our buck out of these efforts. So I suspect that in the coming months, we'll have more to you on kind of an overall plan and vision on how to implement everything that was passed and how it could all work together to really have that sustainable growth that we're seeking for the state of Colorado. So exciting times, but a lot of work to have in front of us. So thanks for all the volunteer hours that I know you'll be giving on this board to make it come to fruition. Shoshana, I'll hand it back to you if you have more slides.
All right, let's pick up where the deck left off. Could we, sorry, I'm having an issue seeing my own slides.
Did you want me to hop in here, Shoshana?
Yeah, Kate, why don't you hop in on the slides just because I'm having a slight tech issue and
Yeah, no worries. Happy
I
to.
lost them.
So as Director Liu mentioned, we have 3 new cash funds that are established as part of the new business purpose of CTE. The first and largest one is the formula grants. So you can see this is really directly from the legislation, what would be eligible for funding under those formula grants. Importantly, admin and operating is eligible in addition to capital expenses. And so because it's a formula grant, the CTE board will be tasked with developing that formula. The legislature has given us some guidelines that said that the formula is to be based on population density, local zoning, transit ridership, vehicle revenue miles, share of disproportionately impacted community population, and other transit related criteria that the board might find relevant. So in the coming months, we will be working with the board to help develop that formula that would dictate how that 70% of revenue will be distributed out to agencies. On the next slide, this is just a little bit more detail on the local transit grant program cash fund. This is competitive grants. So this will look similar to what the board did as we were standing up the initial electrification grant programs for CTE. So again, a lot of eligibility for transit agencies across the board in a variety of different projects that they might want to pursue with this funding stream. And we as a board would be setting up the eligibility criteria, the notice of funding availability, all those documents that we put together for the original business purpose. This would look very similar to that. And then the next slide is a little more detail on the rail program cash fund. As was mentioned, this funding is for passenger rail projects of statewide significance. And so the board will also have a role in determining how these funds are allocated in conjunction with other funding sources from Senate Bill 184 as well. And then the next slide, I think, is our implementation timeline. So the oil and gas production fees that fund these new transit-related funding will take effect on July 1st of 2025, so about a year from now. And how the fees will be collected is based on a quarterly process that starts with the Carbon Management Commission announcing a spot price for oil and gas. So they will first announce that spot price on October 1st of 2025, and then they'll do it every quarter thereafter. But October 1st will be the first time the spot price is announced. By November 1st, the Clean Transit Enterprise Board will have to meet and set our oil and gas fee for that quarter. Then we'll notify the Department of Revenue, publish the fee amount on our website. And then from there, all the producers of oil and gas will file a return and pay that quarterly production fee, and they have a specific amount of time to do that. It will be on or before January 1st, 2026, when that first payment will come into the Department of Revenue. So we estimate that revenue from these new fees will be flowing from the Department of Revenue to the Clean Transit Enterprise around the beginning of the calendar year in January of 2026. So we have about 18 months to get everything stood up, to make all of the decisions, and to really start getting the board up to speed on everything here. So 18 months might sound like a lot, but I think it's going to be a lot of work for the board to undertake. So we're going to be working on all those items between now and when first revenue starts to flow in January of 2026. The next slide talks a little more specifically about impacts to the clean transit enterprise. As folks remember, we were meeting quite frequently in the beginning as the enterprise was initially stood up to deal with a lot of administrative items in addition to setting up our initial grant programs. We will once again probably, and then since then we've moved to more of a quarterly cadence now that things are up and running. With the new business purpose, we do believe that the board will need to be meeting more frequently in order to make sure that we are able to successfully implement this new business purpose. In addition, we want to make sure that we provide ample opportunities for stakeholder and public feedback as part of our meetings. So we will be very interested in stakeholder feedback as we're designing the formula to go to the local transit operations cash fund, as we're standing up the new competitive grants. And then we just have some administrative things that the board will need to deal with. We'll need to update our rule, our bylaws, our budget, some of our procedures, the 10-year plan, the website. So staff will be working through all of those necessary updates with the board in the coming months as well. In addition, our initial business purpose was, of course, related to electrification for transit and helping transit agencies move to zero emission vehicles. And in the original kind of few meetings of the board, we were providing some background content and information about the state of the zero emission vehicle market for transit and agency experiences. This new business purpose is related to, general transit operations, general transit administration, in addition to capital that may or may not be zero emissions. So we want to make sure that the board is well briefed on all of that background information that will help you to make informed decisions. So we are going to be starting to add content to the board meetings that will get folks up to speed. We're going to start today with a quick briefing on our transit connections study so you can understand what's going on in the planning world related to transit in the state. We also, similar to when the Clean Transit Enterprise was initially stood up, the staff will also be seeking a Transportation Commission loan to cover our startup costs related to the new business purpose. We do not want to use the retail delivery fees for 18 months while we're waiting for the oil and gas revenue to start flowing. We want to make sure that that funding is available for the retail delivery fee business purpose, which is zero emission transit buses. So we're going to be working with our accounting and finance staff to put together an estimate and get a loan so we can cover the startup costs. And then once the oil and gas revenue starts flowing, we will pay back the loan, similar to what we did initially when we were waiting for revenue to start from the retail delivery fee. So we'll be presenting that information to you in the coming months. And then we did get permission in the legislation to hire some additional staff as well. As you saw from the slides, our initial business purpose was, $10 to $12 million a year. We've been able to manage that with a minimal amount of leveraged staff from CDOT. This is a much larger amount of funding. And we will be pursuing some additional full-time employees in order to make sure that we're able to successfully execute. And I think that's the last slide, but we can open it up to questions to either myself or Executive Director Lou or Lisa Kaufman if anyone has any questions.
I have a question. I'm just curious. It's pure curiosity, but why was the decision made to steer this funding towards CTE and not DTR as just part of the regular stuff that they do on an annual basis, as far as making grants and work with agencies to do the thing? I'm just curious.
I'm happy to take that. So the way that Tabor works is the legislature can pass fees into enterprises in order to pay for a business, a government business. And so you couldn't pass a fee legislatively and direct it to the underlying agency, transit and rail division for that business. It has to be housed in a independent enterprise to not trigger, the need to go to a vote of the people or the, money counting towards the state's budget's Tabor cap.
I figured it had something to do with Tabor, and thanks for the refresher course. I appreciate it.
Any other questions? Well, I think I'll just conclude by saying we're very excited to work with the board on this exciting new business purpose, and more to come at our future meetings. The other thing that I will note, I'm not sure how much longer Executive Director Liu is able to remain on the call, but she is actually the delegate for the clean, or she's the official appointment to the Clean Transit Enterprise for CDOT. And she has delegated to Eric Sabina, who is not here. So if we would like to take action on either of the two decision items, the approval of the minutes and the approval of the spending authority request, Executive Director Liu would fulfill our need for a quorum. So I'll leave that to you, Mr. Chair, if you'd like to do that.
Yes, thank you, Kay. I think at a minimum, yeah, we should tackle the approval of the meeting minutes from the last meeting, and then maybe we can open up the other item for discussion and potentially move ahead with that. So with that, yeah, I'll make a motion to approve the meeting minutes from the February 20th, 2024 CTE board meeting.
I'll second.
Okay, those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say nay. Okay, meeting minutes approved. On the other item, I think personally, I'm inclined to suggest we request legislation for the rollover of CTE funds. But I'd be curious to see what others think.
I'm on board with that 100%.
Okay.
I'm supportive of that as well.
Same here.
Okay. Are there any other questions about that? Any other discussion?
I'm not a board member. I'm just kind of following so seek legislation for what?
So Lisa, this
let's
was
see
a
if-
spending authority
Okay.
question. It's related to the original business purpose for CTE being annually appropriated and all the new revenue streams being continuously appropriated. And we're seeking the board's approval to submit a decision item that would request that the original Clean Transit Enterprise retail delivery fees get continuous spending authority. So we covered that before you joined. I apologize.
Yeah, it sounds like the way the 230 fees were set up would give us continuous spending authority, but the same is not true for the zero emission vehicle grants. Okay, thanks for bringing up the slide again. With that, I will move for the Clean Transit Enterprise to direct enterprise staff to submit a decision item for fiscal year 26 that requests continuous spending authority for the Clean Transit Enterprise cash fund.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say nay. Okay. Motion approved. Thank you all. And with that, I think our last item on the agenda is this transit connection study from Paul DeRocher. So Paul, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So again, Paul DeRocher, Director of Division of Transit and Rail. One of the things that folks may have heard about either through their involvement in TRAC or participation in Transit Monthly is a study that actually came from a similar funding pool as the Mountain Rail Service Development Plan. And this study, we're calling the Transit Connection Study. For folks that have been around for a while, a previous similar iteration of this was called the Intercity and Regional Bus Plan. The Transit Connection Study is kind of taking that foundation from the what we referred to as the ICB, the Intercity and Regional Bus Plan, and expanding it a little bit further, primarily because we are pursuing at a rapid pace the implementation of passenger rail services in Colorado. And so we need to be able to plan for how people are going to both access and depart those stations, both for rail as well as our Bustang family of services. So that includes the mainline services up and down I-25, and then on I-70 west towards Grand Junction from Denver. So in addition to the Outrider services. So we haven't had a plan, an update to that previous ICB effort in quite some time, and we need to have a blueprint for the way those services are going to expand in the future. And so that's the primary foundational effort and focus for the Transit Connection Study, or TCS, is to help us inform how we're going to plan and make investment decisions in that statewide transit network, both in bus and rail. So I think we can go to the next slide. So main thing when we're kicking off any study is to set a clear sort of set of values for what is going to determine how and where that transit system expands. So these bullets that you can read here, I'll just go through them that are really kind of helping us to guide how we're approaching the expansion of this system. One, that is comprehensive. I think we have a decent network. If you look at the Outrider, Bustang, and rail network layered on top of one another, it looks pretty good in terms of lines on a map. We're also looking at that in terms of temporal gaps. So if you get into the weeds on the Outrider network, you'll see that in many cases, those are a single round trip. That's not the greatest in terms of comprehensiveness of that service. And so looking at ways that we can expand and fill temporal gaps. Accessibility and equity. These are important things related to any transit system, primarily because underserved and transit-dependent communities, I guess by definition, are really needing and relying on transit services the most. We want to be able to focus services there so that we're bringing transit to the folks who need it most. That's reliable. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We don't want buses breaking down. We want to be able to ensure that when buses are on their trips, that they're not getting stuck in traffic as much as possible. So identifying places where the bus is getting caught up in traffic. Is there an opportunity for us to add infrastructure, potentially technology solutions like transit signal priority to help free up those services? That it's integrated. Had the pleasure of going to a public meeting last night in Winter Park with Director Liu and talking about Mountain Rail. And I think this is a big one a lot on the minds of a lot of the communities along that alignment, is how are their communities going to connect to this service in the future? We want to be able to support that too with this effort, that it's sustainable both from a financial as well as environmental standpoint. And then something that we also talked a lot about last night is how can we encourage denser development with our transit investments and really maximize those services in a way that complements the urban design that fosters ridership. Next slide. So here's some of the major project elements. And this is, you could probably look at this in terms of chronology as well. The current state of transit, that's where we're at right now. We have a draft of this report, and once we have gone through our initial review, I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for this group to weigh in. But it's really just a snapshot in time. So what does the existing transit network look like? We need to know where we're at right now in order to determine where we want to go in the future. So it's more or less an existing conditions report. In the future, in the very near future, we're going to be beginning some outreach to agencies throughout the state. The first kind of part of this, and I'll get to this on the next slide, is more about kind of reaching out to agencies and determining where they would like to see further investments from the state to complete a more comprehensive network. And the second part is, after we complete that gaps analysis, is making sure that we hit the mark, we listened, and we followed through on some of the feedback that we got. The gaps analysis itself is pretty much self-explanatory. So where are the gaps, both in terms of time, geography, even down to infrastructure? Where do we see a need to complete the transit network more holistically? And then lastly, we'll have a set of recommendations that we hope will feed directly into our 10-year planning process that's just about ready to get off the ground here at CDOT, and that we have a clear sort of roadmap for both the recommendations that we are making out of this effort, and then assigning some funding from it through the 10-year planning process. Next slide. So talked about this a little bit. I think some of the maybe relevant parts for the folks on the call today is, who are we reaching out to? I think for the most part, what we're looking at is reaching out to a lot of the transit agencies throughout the state. I think some of the ones that are listed here are kind of in what we would consider like the Big 10, but that does not mean that we are not going to be reaching out to the rural agencies as well. Those agencies are as important, if not more important than the bigger ones, because they don't have as many resources to bring to the table, and in some cases are more dependent on the state to help fill those transit gaps. So that will be a part both in that pre and post gaps analysis effort. And then in terms of deliverables, we're looking at creating a final report, knowing that not everyone has time to read a 200-page report, or wherever we land. We're also planning to produce some more summary style deliverables, such as a story map that folks have maybe seen on GIS, that helps to really illustrate, here's where we're at now, here's where we want to go, here's how we're going to fill those gaps with both funding and resources. And so that should be a great way for folks to both shop the recommendations as well as feedback, provide feedback. Next slide. And that's what I have for you. So I'm happy to take any questions if folks have them. I will mention, while people are thinking of their questions, we are working with Cambridge Systematics on this. They're going to help us specifically with that gaps analysis. And that's great, because Cambridge is actually helping us with our Mountain Rail project. They're a sub to our prime consultant on that. And one of the major elements that they're going to be helping us with is to update our statewide model. So the statewide model does a great job of helping to forecast commuter trips, but it doesn't do a great job of forecasting recreational trips. And we see this as a pretty significant and growing market, especially on busting, but particularly for the rail services as well. Those recreational trips comprise a significant amount of congestion in the state, as anyone knows that has tried to head out I-70 on the weekends. And so Cambridge is going to help us update that model and be able to predict, again, where are we seeing congestion? Where do we need to potentially add infrastructure to enable that transit service to operate as efficiently as possible?
I have a few questions. First off, thank you, Paul. I love the way you're thinking about the whole process, including what you said about responding to feedback from transit agencies. I think that's really smart. First, just curious whether like the gap analysis and the plan will be considering the current budget. Like, is it a fiscally constrained plan and then an unconstrained scenario where we could potentially raise more money for transit to fill the gaps?
Yeah, you nailed it. Yeah. So we'll have both a constrained and unconstrained plan. So out of the gaps analysis, we will have the unconstrained version. And then as we enter into kind of the financial analysis piece, which I recognize I didn't talk specifically about that, that's where we'll start to assign a constrained version and prioritize. And that's where I think it'll probably be the most critical part of where we get feedback from agencies and other stakeholders.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, just a couple other questions. One is, since you mentioned Cambridge Systematics, I think that's the same consultant that did CDOT's cost benefit analysis for the greenhouse gas planning standard, where they actually like quantify the economic and social benefits of VMT reduction. And I'm just wondering if we could put something like that or you could put something like that into the statewide transit plan, just to explain the benefits of transit to Coloradans on a cost perspective, economic development, emissions, just like down the list. Because I think some of that gets lost, or is just assumed that people know when they don't.
Yeah. So you're saying kind of update the GHG or the cost benefit analysis of the previous report and including it in the TCS. Is that kind of what I understood?
Something like that. I mean, it's not like fully formed idea, but like say that you take the unconstrained transit scenario and talk about the total, say, cost savings for Coloradans and avoided transportation costs, reduction in emissions and congestion, all these things we stand to gain from building out a stronger and more comprehensive transit system.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly possible. Yeah, I like that idea.
Okay, and then one more, then I'll stop. But the last one would be, will the study look at potential funding opportunities? I came across this report maybe 6 months ago. I have to go find it, but it looked at how states are flexing some of the federal funds from the IIJA, and some of them are using a pretty significant chunk for transit. I actually don't remember where Colorado was on that list, but it'd be nice to see sort of like all the IIJA funding opportunities, which ones can be used for transit, and sort of what the opportunity is there.
Yes, we are definitely including that in our scope. So, and we've already kind of started a lot of that with, particularly on the rail side. But you're right, a lot of those funding opportunities are open to transit in general. So yes.
If there are no other questions, I'll ask one more, which is just a quick one about the timeline. Maybe you had this on one of the slides and I might have missed it, but yeah.
That's a great question. Actually, I didn't cover that. We are moving fast and furious with this. We want to be able to line up with the 10-year planning process. So we're hoping to wrap up by the end of the calendar year. So that's our goal, and we're sticking to it.
All right. Any other questions? Any other topics for discussion from the board members? Anyone else on the call? If not, we can adjourn the meeting a few minutes early.
Thank you all.
Thanks. I guess before we adjourn, just quickly, we will be sending out a poll for August for our next meeting. At that meeting, we expect to present the capital award recommendations for the clean transit retail delivery fee, and then provide an update on where we stand on when we might issue the planning grants for round 2 for the CTE awards. And then we'll also continue to sprinkle in some of the oil and gas production fee topics related to SB 230 implementation. So that's our plan. So you'll be hearing from Desiree on a good date for the August meeting.
All right, great. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.